The Man Who Traveled with the Oshie, by Edogawa Ranpo. Unless this story was a dream or a hallucination of my temporary madness, the man who traveled with that Oshie must have been a madman. However, just as dreams sometimes offer us a glimpse of another world, a world somehow askew from our own, and just as madmen see and hear things entirely beyond our perception, perhaps I, too, through some uncanny lens of the atmosphere, caught a momentary glimpse of a corner of another world, lying outside the field of vision of this one. It happened on a warm, overcast day, the date of which I cannot recall. I was on my way back from a trip to Wozu to see the mirage. When I tell this story, close friends sometimes interrupt me, saying, "But you've never been to Wozu, have you?" When they say that, I realize I can't offer any concrete proof of when I went to Wozu. So perhaps it was a dream after all. But I have never had a dream with such vivid colors. The scenery in dreams, like movies, is completely devoid of color. Yet the scenery from the train window on that occasion, centered around the lurid picture of the Oshie, was burned into my memory as vividly as the pupil of a snake's eye, dominated by the colors of purple and crimson. Can there be such a thing as a technicolor dream? I saw a mirage for the first time in my life. Having imagined that quaint picture of the beautiful dragon palace floating within the breath of a clam, I was struck by a surprise bordering on terror, a feeling of oily sweat oozing from my pores, when I saw the real mirage. A swarm of people, like grains of beans, were gathered along the pine-lined beach of Wozu, holding their breath and gazing at the vast expanse of sky and sea. I had never seen such a still, dumbly silent sea. It was also quite a surprise to me, as I had always imagined the Sea of Japan to be rough. The sea was grey, without a single ripple, and seemed like a boundless, continuing swamp. And unlike the Pacific Ocean, there was no horizon. The sea and the sky melted into the same grey, covered by a haze of unknown thickness. Unexpectedly, in the upper haze, which I had assumed was the sky, large white sails, like ghosts, glided across what was actually the surface of the sea. The mirage was like a vast movie projected onto the sky, as if ink had been dropped onto the surface of a milky film and allowed to bleed naturally. The distant forests of the Noto Peninsula, through the distorted lens of the atmosphere, appeared vaguely, yet absurdly magnified in the sky right before my eyes, like black insects under a poorly focused microscope, looming over my head. It resembled a strangely shaped black cloud, but unlike a cloud, whose location is clearly defined, the mirage's distance was strangely ambiguous. It looked like a giant apparition floating on the distant sea, or at times, a grotesque haze approaching within a foot of my face, and even like a single spot of cloudiness floating on the surface of my cornea. This ambiguity of distance gave the mirage an eerie, almost insane quality beyond imagination. Vague, jet black, gigantic triangles piled up like towers, then crumbled in an instant, stretched horizontally and raced like long trains, then broke apart and looked like the tops of standing cypress trees. While appearing motionless, it would subtly transform into entirely different shapes. If the magic of the mirage could drive people mad, I probably wouldn't have escaped its spell until I was on the train back home. After standing for more than 2 hours gazing at the unearthly spectacle in the sky, I left Wozu that evening and remained in a distinctly unusual state of mind until I spent the night on the train. Perhaps it was a kind of temporary madness, like a spree killer, that brushed against and afflicted the human mind. I boarded the train from Wozu station to Ueno around 6 o'clock in the evening. By some strange coincidence, or perhaps it's always like that on trains around there, the second-class car I boarded was as empty as a church, with only one other passenger huddled in a cushion in the far corner. The train ran endlessly along the desolate coast, over steep cliffs and sandy beaches, echoing with the monotonous sound of machinery. A dark, blood-colored sunset was vaguely visible deep within the haze over the swamp-like sea. Unusually large white sails glided across it like a dream. Since it had been a humid, windless day, the breeze that crept in through the occasionally opened train windows was fleeting, like a ghost. Numerous short tunnels and rows of snow fences striped the vast grey sky and sea as they passed by. As we passed the Oyashirazu cliffs, dusk had fallen to the point where the electric lights inside the train seemed as bright as the sky outside. It was just around then that the sole other passenger in the far corner suddenly stood up, spread a large black satin furoshiki on the cushion, and began to wrap a flat, 2x3-foot package, which had been propped against the window, inside it. This struck me as somehow odd. The flat object was probably a framed picture. Its front side had been propped against the window, as if for some special reason. It must have been deliberately taken out of the furoshiki and placed that way. And when he rewrapped it, I caught a glimpse of the brightly colored picture on the surface of the frame. It looked strangely vivid, somehow out of the ordinary. I took another look at the owner of this peculiar luggage. I was surprised to find that the owner himself was even more peculiar than his luggage. He wore a very old-fashioned black suit, with a narrow collar and sloping shoulders, the kind you only see in faded photographs from our father's youth. But somehow it fit his tall, long-legged frame perfectly, even making him look rather dashing. His face was slender, and apart from his slightly glittering eyes, his features were well-formed, giving him a smart impression. His neatly parted hair was abundantly black and shiny, making him look about 40 at first glance. But upon closer inspection, his face was covered with a multitude of wrinkles, making him look closer to 60. The contrast between his jet-black hair and the wrinkles crisscrossing his pale face startled me when I first noticed it, giving him a very eerie feeling. When he finished carefully wrapping his package, he suddenly turned his face towards me. Since I had been intently watching his movements, our gazes locked. He then curved the corners of his lips as if embarrassed, offering a faint smile. I involuntarily nodded in return. For a while, as we passed 2 or 3 small stations, we remained in our respective corners, occasionally exchanging glances before awkwardly looking away. Outside, it had become completely dark. Even when I pressed my face against the windowpane and peered out, there wasn't a single light to be seen, except for the occasional ship's sidelights flickering far out at sea. Our long, dimly lit train car seemed like the only world left, moving on and on, rattling endlessly in the vast darkness. It felt as if the entire world, every living creature, had vanished without a trace, leaving only the two of us in that dimly lit car. No passengers boarded our second-class car at any station, and neither the train boy nor the conductor made an appearance. Thinking about it now, that, too, seems exceedingly strange. I began to feel increasingly afraid of the man with the appearance of a Western magician, who seemed to be both 40 and 60 years old at the same time. Fear, when there's nothing else to distract from it, grows infinitely large, spreading throughout the body. Finally, filled with fear to the tips of my hairs, I could bear it no longer. I suddenly stood up and walked briskly towards the man in the opposite corner. It was precisely because I felt both pity and fear for him that I approached him. I gently sat down on the cushion facing him and, with a strange, inverted feeling, as if I myself were some kind of apparition, peered into his wrinkled white face, which looked even more peculiar up close, narrowing my eyes and holding my breath. The man had been watching me since I left my seat, and as I peered into his face, he pointed his chin at the flat package beside him, as if waiting for me. Without any preamble, as if it were the most natural greeting, he said, "Is it this?" His tone was so matter-of-fact that it startled me. "Is this what you want to see?" Taken aback by his tone, I blurted out something strange. I hadn't stood up because I wanted to see his package. "I'd be happy to show it to you. I've been thinking about it for a while now. I figured you must have come to see this." The man, or rather, the old man, as it would be more appropriate to call him, said this as he deftly untied the large furoshiki with his long fingers and propped the frame-like object against the window, this time facing outwards. I glanced at its surface and involuntarily closed my eyes. I don't know why, even now, but I felt I had to. I kept my eyes shut for a few seconds. When I opened them again, there before me was something strange, unlike anything I had ever seen. That being said, I lack the words to clearly explain what was so strange about it. The frame depicted a scene, like the backdrop of a kabuki play's palace, with multiple rooms receding into the distance, using extreme perspective. Blue tatami mats and lattice ceilings stretched far back, painted luridly with mud pigments, primarily indigo. In the foreground to the left, a jet-black, clumsy, stutter-like window was depicted, and beside it, a writing desk of the same color was placed at an impossible angle. The background resembled the unique style of votive picture tablets. If that helps to visualize it. Within this backdrop, 2 figures, about a foot tall, stood out. They stood out because they were made of Oshie, a type of padded applique work. A white-haired old man in an old-fashioned black velvet suit sat stiffly. Strangely, except for the hair color, his features and even the tailoring of his suit were identical to those of the old man holding the frame. A beautiful young woman of 17 or 18, dressed in a shimmering crimson figured satin kimono with a black satin obi, her hair styled in a glossy yuiwata, leaned against the old man's knee with an indescribable air of bashfulness. The scene resembled a love scene from a play. The contrast between the old man in the suit and the young woman was certainly unusual, but that wasn't what I found strange. While the background was crudely drawn, the craftsmanship of the Oshie figures was astonishing. The faces were made of white silk, with the wrinkles, even the finest ones, meticulously recreated. The young woman's hair was made of real hair, implanted strand by strand and styled like a human's. The old man's head was also likely made of real white hair, carefully implanted. The suit had proper seams and tiny, grain-of-rice-sized buttons in the right places. The swell of the young woman's breasts, the sensual curves of her thighs, the spilled crimson crepe, the glimpse of her skin, and the shell-like fingernails on her fingers were all incredibly lifelike. I felt that if I looked through a magnifying glass, I might even see pores and fine hairs. My only experience with Oshie was the actor likenesses on her goiter, battledores, and while some of those are quite elaborate, this Oshie was far beyond comparison in its intricacy. It must have been the work of a master craftsman. But even that wasn't what I found strange. The whole frame seemed quite old. The mud pigments in the background were chipped in places, and the young woman's crimson figured satin and the old man's velvet were faded beyond recognition. Yet, despite the chipping and fading, they retained an indescribable, lurid quality, shimmering with a vitality that seemed to burn into my retinas. But even that wasn't what I meant by strange. It was, if I must put it into words, that both Oshie figures seemed alive. In Bunraku Puppet Theatre, once or twice during a day's performance, and only for a fleeting moment, a puppet manipulated by a master puppeteer might, as if touched by the breath of God, appear truly alive. These Oshie figures felt like those living moments, captured and affixed to a board before the life could escape, eternally preserved in that state. Perhaps noticing the look of surprise on my face, the old man said, in an almost joyful tone, practically shouting, "Ah, you understand, don't you?" He then carefully unlocked a black leather case hanging from his shoulder, took out a very old-fashioned pair of binoculars, and offered them to me. "Here, please take a look through these opera glasses." "No, you're too close." "Excuse me, but a little further back." "Yes, right about there would be perfect." It was a truly bizarre request, but driven by boundless curiosity, I stood up and moved 5 or 6 steps away from the frame as the old man instructed. He held the frame with both hands and tilted it towards the light so I could see it better. Looking back, it must have been a truly bizarre, almost insane scene. The binoculars were probably an imported item from 20 or 30 years prior, a strangely shaped prism binocular like the ones we often saw on opticians' signs as children. The black covering was worn from use, revealing the brass underneath in places. Like the old man's suit, it was an old-fashioned, nostalgic item. Intrigued, I fiddled with the binoculars for a while, and as I brought them up to my eyes, just as I was about to look through them, the old man suddenly let out a scream. I nearly dropped the glasses. "No. No. You're holding them backwards. You mustn't look through them backwards." "No." The old man had turned pale, his eyes wide, and he waved his hands frantically. I couldn't understand why looking through the binoculars backwards was such a big deal. Oh, right, backwards, was it? Preoccupied with looking through the binoculars, I hadn't paid much attention to the old man's strange behavior. I quickly turned the binoculars around and put them to my eyes, peering at the Oshie figures. As the lenses came into focus, the two circular fields of vision gradually merged into one, and a blurry, rainbow-like image became increasingly clear. The young woman's upper body, magnified to an astonishing size, filled my entire field of vision, as if it were the whole world. That I have never seen anything appear in such a way, before or since, and it's difficult to describe. The closest analogy I can think of is the momentary glimpse of a diving ama, female diver, seen from a boat. When the ama's naked body is at the bottom, the complex movements of the blue water distort her form, making her body look unnaturally writhing and blurry like seaweed, a pale, ghostly figure. As she rises, the blue of the water gradually fades, her shape becomes clearer, and when her head pops out of the water, the white ghost instantly reveals its true form as a human. In much the same way, the Oshie young woman materialized before me in the binoculars, coming to life as a full-sized, living woman beyond the lenses of the 19th century prism binoculars. There was another world entirely beyond our comprehension, where the young woman in her yuiwata and the white-haired man in his old-fashioned suit lived their strange lives. I felt a strange sensation, something I can't describe, like I was being shown something I shouldn't see, something magical and forbidden. Yet I was captivated, drawn into that uncanny world. The young woman wasn't moving, but her whole being was transformed from what I had seen with the naked eye. She was filled with life. Her pale face was flushed with a slight pinkness, her chest pulsed, I actually heard a heartbeat, and through her crepe kimono, a youthful, vibrant energy seemed to emanate from her body. After scanning her entire body with the binoculars, I turned them towards the unfortunate white-haired man she was leaning against. He, too, was alive in the world of the binoculars. He had his arm around the young woman, who looked to be at least 40 years his junior, and he appeared happy. But strangely, his wrinkled face, magnified to fill the lens, held a subtle expression of anguish deep within those hundreds of wrinkles. Perhaps it was because the old man's face was so unnaturally close, a foot in front of my eyes, due to the magnification of the lenses, but the longer I stared, the more terrifying it became, a strange expression of a mixture of grief and terror. Seeing this, I felt a wave of nausea, and looking through the binoculars became unbearable. I involuntarily looked away and glanced around. I was, after all, still in a desolate night train. The framed Oshie, the old man holding it, everything was as before. It was pitch black outside the window, and the monotonous rhythm of the wheels continued unchanged. I felt like I had woken from a nightmare. "You look rather puzzled," the old man said. He placed the frame back against the window, sat down, and gestured for me to sit opposite him. He stared at my face. "I feel a bit dizzy. It's rather stuffy, isn't it?" I said, trying to cover my confusion. The old man hunched over, brought his face close to mine, and wiggled his long fingers on his lap as if signaling something. In a low whisper, he said, "They were alive, weren't they?" Then, as if about to reveal something important, he hunched over even further, his glittering eyes wide open, staring at my face intently, and whispered, "Wouldn't you like to hear their story? Their true story?" I thought I might have misheard his low, murmuring voice due to the rocking of the train and the clatter of the wheels. "Did you say story?" "Yes, their story," the old man replied, still in a low voice. "Especially the story of the white-haired old man. From when he was young." For some reason, I was speaking oddly out of tune that night. "Yes, the story of when he was 25. "I'd certainly like to hear it," I said, as if urging him to tell me the story of an ordinary, living person, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The old man's wrinkles creased into a seemingly joyful expression. "Ah, so you will listen," he said, and then began the following strange tale. It was a momentous event in my life, so I remember it well. It was the evening of April 27, 1895, when my brother became like that. He pointed at the old man in the Oshie. At the time, both my brother and I were still living at home in Nihonbashi, and our father ran a kimono shop. It was shortly after the Asakusa Jinkai, 12-story tower, was built. My brother loved foreign things and novelties, so he was delighted, going up to Ryunkaku almost every day. Take these opera glasses, for example. He found them in a curious shop in Yokohama's Chinatown, saying they belonged to a foreign ship's captain. He paid quite a hefty sum for them, especially for those days. Every time the old man said "my brother," he glanced or pointed at the Oshie old man as if he were sitting right there. He spoke as if he were confusing his actual brother with the white-haired Oshie figure, as if the Oshie were alive and listening to him, conscious of a third person nearby. But strangely, I didn't find it odd at all. At that moment, we seemed to be inhabiting a world beyond the laws of nature, a world somehow askew from our own. "Have you ever been up the Jinkai?" "Oh, you haven't. That's a shame. It was a truly extraordinary, peculiar structure. I wonder what magician built it. The exterior was designed by an Italian engineer named Barton, also they said. Well, just imagine. Asakusa Park back then was known for things like the Spider-Man show, the girls' sword dance, ball walking, Gunsue's top spinning, and peep shows. The most unusual things were the miniature Mount Fuji and the maze, a show with hidden cedar trees. Then, all of a sudden, this incredibly tall, brick tower sprang up. It was quite a shock. It was 46 ken high, more than half a block, and its octagonal top, pointed like a Chinaman's hat, could be seen from anywhere in Tokyo if you climbed any slight elevation. As I was saying, it was the spring of 1895, shortly after my brother acquired these opera glasses. Something strange began to happen to him. Father was terribly worried, thinking he might be losing his mind. And as you can imagine, I was very fond of my brother, so his peculiar behavior worried me sick. He wouldn't eat properly, wouldn't speak to anyone in the family, and when he was home, he'd shut himself up in his room, lost in thought. He became thin, his face the color of earth, like someone with consumption, his eyes constantly darting around. He wasn't particularly ruddy-faced to begin with, but now he was even paler and more withdrawn. It was truly pitiful to see. And yet, despite all this, he would go out every day without fail, from noon until dusk, as if going to work. When asked where he was going, he wouldn't say a word. Mother was worried and tried everything to get him to open up about what was troubling him, but he wouldn't budge. This went on for about a month. I was so worried that one day I decided to secretly follow him to see where he was going. Mother had asked me to do it. That day, too, was a gloomy, unpleasant day, much like today. In the afternoon, he put on his black velvet suit, which was considered quite fashionable at the time, slung these opera glasses over his shoulder, and walked towards the horse-drawn streetcar line on Nihonbashi Street. I followed him discreetly. And what do you know, he waited for the Ueno-bound streetcar and hopped on. Unlike today's trains, it wasn't easy to follow someone by taking the next car. There were very few cars running. I had no choice but to splurge the allowance Mother had given me and hire a rickshaw. A rickshaw puller worth his salt could easily keep up with a streetcar. When my brother got off the streetcar, I got out of the rickshaw and continued to follow him on foot. And where do you think he ended up? At the Sensoji Temple in Asakasa. He went through Nakamai's Dori, past the main hall, through the crowds and the sideshow booths, all the way to the Jinikai. He entered the stone gate, paid the entrance fee, and disappeared into the tower through the entrance marked Ryunkaku. I was stunned. I never dreamed he would be going to such a place every day. As a child, I was still under 20 at the time. I had the strange thought that he might be bewitched by the tower. That I had only been up the Jinikai once, with my father, and I hadn't been back since, so I felt a bit uneasy. But since my brother had gone up, I had no choice but to follow, lagging one floor behind him, climbing the dim stone stairs. The windows were small, and the brick walls were thick, making it cold and damp like a cellar. Since it was during the Sino-Japanese War, the walls were lined with war paintings, which were quite a novelty at the time. Lurid, bloody paintings of Japanese soldiers charging with ferocious, wolf-like faces, Chinese soldiers writhing in agony with blood gushing from bayonet wounds in their sides, severed pigtails flying through the air like balloons. These gruesome images shimmered in the dim light from the windows. And the gloomy stone stairs spiraled upwards like a snail's shell. It was a truly unsettling feeling. The top floor was just a railed observation deck, open to the sky. Reaching it, the sudden burst of light after the long, dim climb was startling. The clouds were so low they seemed within reach, and all the rooftops of Tokyo spread out below like so much rubbish. Shinagawa's Odaiba looked like a miniature landscape in a bonseki tray. I fought back the vertigo and looked down. Even the Sensoji Temple was far below, and the booths looked like toys, the people walking around appearing as just heads and feet. There were about a dozen other visitors huddled together at the top, nervously whispering and gazing towards the sea at Shinagawa. My brother was standing apart from them, all alone, with his opera glasses to his eyes, intently scanning the temple grounds. From behind, against the dull, white clouds, his slender figure in the velvet suit stood out sharply. With nothing else visible below but the jumble of rooftops, he looked like a figure in a Western painting, almost divine, and I felt hesitant to speak to him, but I remembered Mother's request, so I approached him and said, "Brother, what are you looking at?" He flinched and turned around, but his face was troubled, and he didn't say anything. I said, "Father and Mother are very worried about you. They've been wondering where you've been going every day, and now I find you here. Please tell me why. At least confide in me, your closest brother." Taking advantage of the fact that no one else was nearby, I pleaded with him at the top of that tower. He was reluctant to open up, but I persisted, and finally, he told me the secret he had been carrying for a month. And his source of anguish was something truly bizarre. He said that about a month ago, while up on the genarative, looking through his opera glasses at the temple grounds, he had caught a glimpse of a young woman's face in the crowd. She was so beautiful, he said, beyond words, almost unearthly. My brother, usually indifferent to women, was so smitten by this woman in his opera glasses that he felt a chill run down his spine. He was so startled that he lowered the glasses, and when he tried to find her again, he couldn't. Though she seemed close through the glasses, she was actually far away, and in such a large crowd, it wasn't easy to find someone again after just a fleeting glimpse from that day on. He couldn't forget the beautiful woman he had seen through the glasses. He was a very shy person, and he fell into a classic lovesickness. People today might laugh, but people back then were much more sentimental. It wasn't uncommon for a man to fall in love and become lovesick after just a glance at a woman. As you can imagine, my brother, dragging his weakened body, went up to the genarative every day, hoping against hope that he might see the woman again in the temple grounds, peering through his glasses. Love is a strange thing. After confiding in me, he started peering through the glasses again as if in a fever. I sympathized with him completely. It was a hopeless, futile search, but I couldn't bring myself to tell him to stop. I was so moved that I teared up as I watched him. And then, I'll never forget that strange and beautiful sight. It was over 30 years ago, but if I close my eyes, I can still see those dreamlike colors vividly. As I said, I was standing behind my brother, and all I could see was the sky. Against the hazy, mottled clouds, his slender figure in his suit stood out like a painting, floating in the air. And then, suddenly, as if fireworks had been set off, countless red, blue, and purple spheres rose into the whitish sky, vying to be first. It's hard to describe, but it was truly picturesque, almost like an omen, and I felt a strange premonition. I quickly looked down and saw that a balloon vendor had accidentally released a bunch of rubber balloons. Rubber balloons themselves were much more of a novelty back then, so even after realizing what they were, I still felt uneasy. It's strange, but perhaps it was triggered by the balloons, but just then, my brother turned to me, his pale face flushed with excitement, his breath coming in gasps. He grabbed my hand and said, "Come on, let's go. We have to hurry." He pulled me along. As we rushed down the stone stairs, I asked him what was going on. He said he had found the young woman. He said she was sitting in a large room with blue tatami mats, and that she would still be there. He remembered the location by a large pine tree near a spacious tatami room behind the main hall. But when we went there and searched, the pine tree was there, but there were no houses around, as if we had been tricked by a fox. I thought he must be delusional, but he looked so dejected that I felt sorry for him. I tried to console him by checking the nearby tea houses, but there was no sign of the young woman. We got separated during the search, but after checking all the tea houses, I returned to the pine tree. A peep show had set up shop there, the barker cracking his whip and calling out to customers. And there was my brother, bent over, intently peering into the peephole. I tapped him on the shoulder and said, "Brother, what are you doing?" He turned around, startled, and I'll never forget the look on his face. How can I describe it? He looked as if he were in a dream, his features slack, his eyes distant, and even his voice sounded strangely hollow. He said, "She's in here. The woman we've been looking for." I quickly paid and looked through the peephole. It was a Yaoya Oshie peep show. The scene depicted Oshie leaning against Kichisa in the study of Kichiji Temple. I remember it vividly. The peep show operators, a husband and wife, sang in raspy voices, keeping time with their whips, a nudge with the knee, a glance with the eyes. That strange melody, a nudge with the knee, a glance with the eyes, still rings in my ears. The figures in the peep show were made of Oshie. They must have been the work of a master craftsman. Oshichi's face was so lifelike and beautiful that even I thought she looked real. No wonder my brother had said what he did. He said, "Even if I know she's just an Oshie figure, I can't give up. It's sad, but I can't. I just want to become a man in that Oshie world, like Kichisa, and talk to her, just once." He just stood there, staring blankly, refusing to move. I realized that the top of the peep show box was open for lighting, and that's how he must have seen it from the top of the genarative. By then, dusk had fallen, the crowds had thinned, and only a few children lingered around the peep show, reluctant to leave. The gloomy clouds from earlier had descended, threatening rain, creating a stifling atmosphere that felt almost maddening. And I heard a dull, drumming sound in my ears. My brother stood there, gazing into the distance, motionless, for what felt like a full hour when night had completely fallen, and the gaslights of the distant ball-walking act began to twinkle beautifully. My brother suddenly snapped out of his trance and grabbed my arm. "I've got it," he said. "Please, hold these opera glasses backwards, put the large lenses to your eyes, and look at me through them." He said something very strange. When I asked him why, he just said, "Just do it, please." I've never been fond of optical instruments. The way they make distant objects jump out at you, or tiny insects appear as large as monsters, has always unsettled me. So I hadn't used his cherished opera glasses much, and that only made them seem more like magical devices. And to hold them backwards and look at him in the dim light behind the Sensoji temple, where you could barely make out a person's face, seemed rather crazy and eerie. But he insisted, so I did as he asked. Since I was looking through them backwards, his figure, standing a few yards away, appeared about 2 feet tall, small but clearly visible against the darkness. Nothing else was visible, just his small figure in his suit, standing perfectly still in the center of the lenses. He must have started walking away, because he grew smaller and smaller until he was just a foot tall, like a cute little doll. And then, his figure seemed to float in the air for a moment, before vanishing into the darkness. That I was terrified. It might sound childish, but at that moment, I was truly filled with a chilling fear, and I dropped the glasses and shouted, "Brother!" I ran in the direction he had disappeared, but no matter how much I searched, I couldn't find him. He couldn't have gone far in such a short time, but he was nowhere to be found. Just like that, my brother vanished from this world. From that day on, I became even more afraid of optical instruments, especially these opera glasses that had belonged to some unknown foreign captain. I became convinced that looking through them backwards would bring misfortune. Now you understand why I reacted so strongly when you held them backwards earlier. Exhausted from the search, I returned to the peep show. And then I realized something. My brother, longing for the Oshie woman, had used the power of the magical opera glasses to shrink himself to her size and slip into the world of the Oshie. I asked the peep show operator, who hadn't yet packed up, to show me the Kichiji scene again. And there he was, my brother, transformed into an Oshie figure, in the lantern light, in Kichisa's place, his arms around Oshichi, a joyful expression on his face. But I wasn't sad. I was so happy for him, so happy that he had fulfilled his wish, that tears came to my eyes. I told the peep show operator that I would buy the picture, no matter the price. Strangely, he didn't seem to notice that my brother, in his suit, was sitting there instead of the pageboy Kichisa. I rushed home and told mother everything. But father and mother wouldn't believe me. They said I must be out of my mind. It's absurd. Ha 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 ha. The old man burst out laughing as if it were all incredibly comical. And strangely, I, too, felt the same way, and laughed along with him. They couldn't believe that a person could become an Oshie, he continued. But the proof is that my brother disappeared completely from this world. And they kept insisting that he had run away, a completely preposterous assumption. It's ridiculous. In the end, I ignored their protests and begged mother for the money, and I finally bought the peep show picture. I took it and traveled with it, from Hercone to Kamakura. I wanted to give my brother a honeymoon. When I'm on a train like this, I can't help but remember those days. I would prop the picture against the window, just like this, and show the scenery to my brother and his beloved. He must have been so happy. And how could she not be touched by his devotion? They were like a real newlywed couple, their faces flushed with shyness, touching each other, whispering sweet nothings. Later, father closed his business in Tokyo and moved back to our hometown near Toyama. I've been living there ever since. It's been over 30 years, and I wanted to show my brother Tokyo again after all this time, so I'm traveling with him like this. But you see, sadly, while she's alive, she's still a man-made thing, so she doesn't age. But my brother, even as an Oshie, is still fundamentally human, so he ages just like we do. Look at him. My brother, who was a handsome young man of 25, now has white hair and a face covered in ugly wrinkles. It must be so sad for him. His beloved stays young and beautiful forever, while he grows old and decrepit. It's terrifying. He always has such a sad look on his face. He's had that anguished expression for years now. It breaks my heart to see him like that. The old man gazed sadly at the old man in the Oshie, then, as if suddenly remembering something, he said, "Oh, I've gone on and on. But you understand, don't you? You don't think I'm crazy like everyone else, do you? Ah, it's been so good to finally talk to someone who understands. Well, I'm sure you're both tired. And I'm sure you're embarrassed that I told your story in front of a stranger. I'll let you rest now." He gently wrapped the framed Oshie in the black furoshiki. For a moment, perhaps it was just my imagination, but I thought the faces of the Oshie figures softened slightly, and they gave me a shy, parting smile. The old man fell silent. I, too, was silent. The train continued to rumble through the darkness. After about 10 minutes, the sound of the wheels slowed, a few lights flickered outside the window, and the train stopped at a small mountain station. A lone station attendant stood on the platform. "Well, goodbye. I'm staying with relatives here tonight," the old man said, holding the wrapped frame, and he stepped off the train. Watching from the window, I saw his tall, thin figure, how much it resembled the old man in the Oshie, pause at the simple gate, hand his ticket to the station attendant, and then disappear into the darkness behind him as if dissolving into the night.